The cloak was still warm when she found it, and that was the first wrong thing. Rose Merrill had washed enough blood out of enough wool in 6 years of service to the Iron Hollow Palace to know the temperature of fresh from the temperature of cold. And this small gray pup cloak, balled into the bottom of the laundry hamper outside the nursery corridor, was warm in the way only living blood is warm. She did not call for anyone. She did not yet understand why her hands had gone steady instead of shaking. She carried the cloak down the servants' stair to the laundry court, where the great copper basins were already steaming for the morning wash, and she knelt at the lowest one, the one no one used because the drain was crooked, and she sank the cloak into the water and watched the pink bloom out of it like a slow flower opening. The tear was at the shoulder, a clean tear, not a snag. Something with a blade had cut through the wool and the lining and into whatever small body had been wearing it. And that something had not been a branch, and had not been a wolf. Rose pressed her thumb against the slit and felt the wool give where the threads were severed. And somewhere behind her, low and silent and as familiar as her own breath, the white shape of Snow lay down on the wet flagstones and put her muzzle on her paws and waited. Rose did not turn to look. She never had to. Snow had walked beside her for 6 winters, in the dreaming hours and in the polished surfaces of windows and bowls. A shadow wolf the size of a yearling, white as the inside of a shell, and Rose had long ago stopped wondering whether she was mad. A mad woman would not have lasted 6 years in the laundry court. A mad woman would have been turned out into the snow the first time the kitchen mistress smelled the wrongness on her, the absence where a wolf should have been. The scent the other servants whispered was broken. Rose was not mad. She was something else, something the palace did not have a word for, and she had long ago decided that not having a word for it was a kindness. She lifted the cloak out of the water. The pink had gone from the wool, but not from her hands. She heard, from very far up in the palace, the sound of horns. Not hunting horns, the other kind. The kind that said something was lost and not yet found. The cat came down the stair before the message did. Soot was a half-grown thing with a torn ear and 1 white sock. The rat catcher who had chosen Rose 4 winters ago, for reasons known only to him. And he came down sideways the way he always did when he was upset, his tail low, his pupils huge. He went straight past Rose to where Snow lay on the flagstones, and he sat down between Snow's front paws as though he were sitting between the front paws of any ordinary dog, and Rose felt the floor tilt under her. Soot had never done that before. Soot had always known Snow was there, had always glanced at the empty air beside Rose as though he could see something the others could not. But he had never gone to her. He had never sat at her chest. He sat now, as though Snow had called him, and Snow lifted her muzzle from her paws and lowered it onto the cat's small back. And the cat did not flinch. Rose's heart did the thing it had always done in Snow's presence. The thing she had stopped trying to describe to herself because describing it made it worse. It went still. Not stopped. Still. As though her heartbeat, which usually lived loudest under her left collarbone, had simply set itself down for a moment to listen. She heard the laundry door bang open above her. She heard Matilda, the head laundress, shouting her name in the tone that meant, "Come now and ask nothing." She heard the words crown pups and woodline and missing and 3 days, although 3 days could not be right because she had washed Bran's other cloak only yesterday, and the children had been alive in the nursery yesterday, because she had heard Era laughing at something through the wall. 3 days. 3 days meant the horns had been blowing for a long time, and no one had thought to tell the laundry court because the laundry court did not matter. Rose stood up with the wet cloak in her hands. Snow stood up with her. Soot wound around her ankles once and then walked ahead of her toward the stair. And Rose understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the blood had, that they were going up. Up out of the laundry court. Up into the war hall. Up to where the Alpha King had spent 6 years pretending he had never seen her flinch. The war hall smelled of sweat and pine resin, and the iron tang of men who had been awake too long. Rose had never crossed its threshold before. The doors were taller than 3 of her stacked end to end, banded in black iron, and the guards on either side had the slack-eyed look of soldiers who had given up expecting orders that would help. They did not stop her. That was the second wrong thing. A maid carrying a wet bundle, a cat at her heels, walking toward a room full of armed men in the middle of a crisis, and not one of the guards lifted a hand. One of them looked at her face, then looked at the cat, then looked away as though the looking hurt him. She pushed the door open with her shoulder because her hands were full. Inside, 20 men stood around a long table covered in maps. The maps were marked with red wax in places and crossed out in black in others, and the black outweighed the red by a great deal. At the head of the table stood Caedmon Vale, the Alpha King of the Iron Hollow, and Rose had not been this close to him in 6 years. He had grown thinner. That was the first thing she registered, foolishly, as though it were her business. He had grown thinner, and the line of his jaw had gone hard in a way it had not been when he was 26 and she was 19, and he had stood in the receiving line of the servant intake, and his eyes had passed over her, and his mouth had said the word unfit and the word breed, and she had not understood then that those 2 words would follow her down every corridor of his house for the rest of her life. He looked up. His eyes found her the way a hunter's eyes find motion. There was no recognition in them. There was no anything in them. He had been awake for 3 days, and his children were gone, and the maid he had called unfit was standing in his war hall with a wet bundle in her arms, and his face went through several expressions very fast and settled finally on a kind of cold, polite fury that she understood was not for her. His brother Arnie stood at his right shoulder. Arnie, the king's only living kin, broad-shouldered and gold-bearded, with the crinkled eyes of a man who laughed easily. And Rose had always liked Arnie, because he had once carried a basket of apples up the back stair for old Murdy when her hip was bad, and he had not made her thank him. Arnie saw Rose now, and his easy face did something complicated and quick before it smoothed. The chief huntsman, Selena, stood across the table, her gray braid coming undone, her gloves still on. The advisors, the captains, the pale boy who carried messages. 20 pairs of eyes. Rose set the cloak on the corner of the table. Her hands left a wet print on the wood. "This is Bran's," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I found it in the laundry an hour ago. The blood was still warm." Silence, the kind of silence that is its own weather. Caedmon looked down at the cloak. He did not touch it. He did not need to. His nostrils flared once, the smallest motion, and Rose watched the color leave his face under his beard. "Where?" "In the hamper, outside the 3rd nursery corridor. Folded under linens." "Folded. Folded." Caedmon's hand closed slowly around the edge of the table. The wood creaked. Selena was already moving, snapping orders, and Arnie was speaking low and fast about searching the corridor, the laundry, every servant who had access, and Rose stood very still and waited for Caedmon to look at her again, because she had not yet said the thing she had come to say. He looked at her. "I know where they are." The room went quiet a second time, and this silence was sharper than the first. "How?" "I dreamed it." A captain laughed, short and ugly, and cut himself off when Caedmon turned his head. Rose did not look at the captain. She looked at the king. "I have a wolf," she said, and her voice did shake now, finally, because she had never said the words aloud to anyone, not in 6 years, not even to herself in the empty hours. "Not the way you have a wolf. She walks beside me in the dreaming. She has shown me the place. I can take you there." Caedmon's mouth did something. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile takes when a man has nothing left to lose and is deciding whether to be cruel. Rose braced for it. She had braced for the cruel shape of his mouth 1,000 times in 6 years, and had always survived it. But the shape did not finish forming. Soot wound between her ankles and sat down on her foot, and the king's eyes dropped to the cat, and then lifted past Rose, past her shoulder, to the empty air beside her. And Rose watched the king of the Iron Hollow see something he could not possibly be seeing. He stopped breathing. He stopped for the length of one heartbeat that did not belong to her. Then he set his hand flat on the table, and he lowered himself, slowly, with the care of a man whose knees are very tired, until he was kneeling on the stone floor of his own war hall, in front of the maid he had once called unfit. Rose Marrow. The use of her full name was like a blade laid carefully on a table. Lead. They rode out within the hour. Rose had never been on a horse. Selina put her up behind the king because there was no time to teach her and no other animal calm enough to carry a doubled rider into the hollow wood at dusk, with a storm already bending the tops of the pines. Rose had thought she would be afraid. She was not. She held the back of Caedmon's belt with both hands because she had been told to, and because his coat smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and a third thing under those. A clean, cold thing she did not have a word for, and she did not let herself think about the third thing. Soot had refused to be left behind. Soot was inside the front of her apron now, a small, warm weight against her ribs, his head poking up between the laces, his pupils small and steady. Snow ran ahead of them in the snow, leaving no prints. Only Rose could see her, and the king, and the cat. The captains and Arnie, and the 8 chosen riders at their flanks could not see Snow at all. And Rose had watched Caedmon decide, in the courtyard, not to tell them. He had given her one long look as he lifted her onto the horse, and the look had said, "You and I will speak of this later." And Rose had nodded, because there was nothing else to do. They rode into the wood at the failing edge of daylight. The Hollowwood, in winter, was a place the palace did not enter without ceremony. The pines stood close enough that 2 men could not ride abreast in most places, and the snow under the canopy was shallow and treacherous, layered over roots and stones, and the wind moved in the high branches with a sound like distant voices. Caedmon's alpha senses went dark a 1/4 mile in. Rose felt it happen because Caedmon's whole body changed under her hands, the easy command of the horse going stiff, his shoulders drawing up. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The other riders felt it too. Selina cursed under her breath. Arnie, riding at the king's left, said quietly, "Same as the search parties. They lose the scent at the 3rd marker, every time. 3 days. 3 days of losing the scent. We thought the storm. It is not the storm." Rose had been quiet. She spoke now into the space between the king's shoulder blades, low enough that only he would hear. "It is the iron. There is iron in the wood. Not the kind that grows. The kind that is buried." Caedmon's spine went very still. "How do you know that?" "She is telling me." A long pause. The horse picked its way over a fallen branch. "Your wolf." "Yes." "What else is she telling you?" Rose closed her eyes. Snow was a warm blank in front of her. No shape, only direction. Northwest, off the cart road, past the second creek, there is a stand of dead pines around a hollow. The hollow has stones in it, old stones. The children are under the stones. Under. She says under. Kaidman turned his head a fraction. She could see the corner of his beard. Are they alive? Rose listened. The stillness that lived where her heartbeat should have been deepened, and Snow, somewhere ahead in the dimming wood, lifted her muzzle and looked back at Rose, and Rose understood the answer without words. Yes, but not for long. He did not ask how she knew. He spurred the horse. Behind them, Selena shouted the change of direction, and the 8 riders peeled off the cart road into the trackless dark, and Rose held the king's belt and let Snow run ahead of her in a country that no living wolf had been able to read for 3 days. Because Snow was not a living wolf, and never had been. They rode for an hour. The light failed entirely. Selena lit a torch and the wind put it out, and she lit another and put it inside a horn lantern, and that one held. The snow began in earnest, sideways and thick, and Rose could not feel her hands on Cadman's belt anymore, but she could not have let go if she had wanted to, because the cold had locked them there. Soot had gone very still inside her apron. She could feel his small heart beating against her ribs, very fast, very calm. They came over a low rise, and there was the second creek, frozen black and silver under the ice, and across it a stand of dead pines, and in the middle of the stand a hollow ringed in standing stones, and Rose saw the stones and made a sound she had not meant to make. She had seen these stones before. She had seen them in every dream she had ever had of Snow, going back 6 years to the first night she had come to the palace and laid her head on the pallet in the laundry attic and dreamed of a white wolf sitting in a circle of gray stones. She had thought the stones were a place inside her. She had thought they were a kindness her own mind had built. They were not inside her. They were here. They had always been here. She made a sound, and Kaidman felt her make it, and he reined in the horse. Rose. She has been bringing me here for 6 years. I did not know. I did not know it was a real place. I thought she lived inside me. She does not live inside me. She lives here. She has been waiting. Kaidman was silent for a long moment. Then he swung down off the horse, and he reached up, and he lifted Rose down after him as though she weighed nothing. And he did not let go of her shoulders until her feet were steady on the snow. Show me. The hollow was deeper than it looked from the rise. They went down into it on foot, leaving the horses with 2 of the riders, and the standing stones rose up around them as they descended. 12 of them, taller than men, leaned at angles by centuries of frost heave. The wind died inside the ring. That was the first impossible thing. Outside the stones, the storm was a blind howling. Inside, the snow fell straight and slow, and Rose's breath made small clouds that hung in the air before they faded. The second impossible thing was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different sound. A low, quiet humming that lived in the bones of the stones, and Rose felt it in her teeth. Snow was already at the center of the ring. She had not waited for them. She stood over a flat stone half buried in snow, and she lifted her muzzle and made a sound Rose had never heard her make. A small, wordless calling, and the stone moved. It did not move on its own. Something underneath it moved. Kaidman was past Rose in 3 strides. He went to one knee and shoved the snow off the stone with his bare hands, and got his fingers under the lip and lifted. And the stone came up easier than a stone that size should have come up, as though something was helping from below. And underneath the stone was a hollow no bigger than a root cellar, and inside the hollow were two small bodies curled together under a bear pelt, and one of them was moving. Era. Rose knew her at once, the dark hair, the gap-toothed mouth open in sleep, and Era's arm was wrapped around Bran's chest, and Bran was the one who had not been moving. But as Kaidman reached down, Bran's eyes opened. Just opened, as though he had been waiting to hear his father's breath. He did not speak. Bran did not speak much even on his best days. He lifted one small mittened hand and laid it on Cadman's wrist. And Cadman, the Alpha King of the Iron Hollow, who had stood through 6 years of counsel and 3 days of fruitless search without his face changing, made a sound Rose would carry to her grave. It was not a sob. It was the sound of an animal being given back something it had stopped hoping for. Era woke at the sound. She blinked up at her father and said in a small, affronted voice, "You took forever." Cadman laughed. It was the wrong laugh, wet and broken, but it was a laugh. And Ada reached up and patted his beard with the disapproving thoroughness of a much older woman. "Bran got cut. On his shoulder. The man with the knife. We hid for ages. The lady told us to." Rose, behind Cadman, went cold all the way down. "What lady, lamb?" Ada looked past her father and saw Rose for the first time, and Ada's face did something Rose had not earned and did not deserve. A small, bright recognition, as though she had been expecting Rose specifically. "The white lady. She was here all the time. She told us where to put the stone over us. She told us when to be quiet. She told us you were coming." She looked at Bran. Bran nodded, solemn as a small judge. "She said her name was Mama." The silence inside the stones went deeper. Kaidman did not move. He was holding both children against his chest now, Era tucked under his right arm, Bran limp against his left, and his face had gone past expression into a place Rose did not know how to look at. Snow stood at the edge of the hollow. She lifted her muzzle and looked at Kaidman. And Kaidman, who had been seeing her in glimpses since the war hall, finally looked back at her properly. He looked at her for a long time. Snow did not move. She let him look. Rose understood, with a slowness that came from being very tired and very cold, that the king was seeing his dead wife for the first time in 6 years, and that she had been 3 corridors away from him for every one of those 6 years, walking beside the laundry girl he had called unfit, because the laundry girl had been the only person in his palace gentle enough to carry her. Kaidman's mouth shaped a word. He did not make sound. The word was a name Rose did not know, because Rose had never been told the name of the dead queen, because servants at her station were not told the names of dead queens. Snow's tail moved once, a slow sweep, and then she turned her head sharply, away from Kaidman, away from the children, and looked up the slope toward the rim of the hollow, and her hackles lifted. Soot, inside Rose's apron, hissed. Rose turned. At the rim of the hollow, ringed in torchlight, stood Arnie. He was alone. He had come down ahead of the other riders, or sent them around the long way, and he stood at the lip of the standing stones with his sword drawn and his easy face gone strange. And Rose, who had liked Arnie for 6 years because he had carried apples for Murdy, understood 3 things at once, the way a person understands things when their body has stopped pretending. The blood on the cloak had been warm because the cut had been recent. The cut had been recent because someone in the palace had taken the children out of their bed 3 days ago and brought them here, and meant to come back and finish what he had started. And the storm and the failed search had bought them time. And that someone had ridden out with them tonight to make sure no one else got to the children first. Arnie was looking at Kaidman, not at Rose, not at the children, at his brother, and his face was sorry. That was the worst of it. He was sorry. Cad, put them down. Step away from them. I will make it quick.
I owe you that much.
Kaidman did not put the children down. He did not stand. He stayed on one knee in the snow with Era tucked under his arm and Bran limp against his chest. And he looked up at his brother, and his face did the thing his face had done in the war hall when Rose had told him about the cloak. The going still, the going empty. And Rose realized he had already known. Not who, but that there was a who. He had been awake 3 days because he had been waiting for the who to show themselves, and he had not been able to name the suspicion to anyone in his own house because the suspicion had been his own brother. Arnie. How long? 6 years. I did not want it to be 6 years. I wanted it to be 6 months. She was supposed to die in the birthing, and the babies were supposed to die with her. And you were supposed to take the wolf out of you that Father always said was poisoning the line. And you were supposed to name me Regent because there would be no heir. And we were supposed to fix it, Cad. The bloodline. The veil line. Father told us. Father told us, and then Father died, and you forgot, but I did not forget. She did not die in the birthing. Wolfsbane in the cordial. She drank it because I made sure she drank it. I sat with her, Cad. I held her hand. She thought it was me being kind. Rose's stillness had become a roaring thing. She could not move. She could not have moved if she had wanted to. Snow, beside her, was no longer the soft, warm shape that had walked at her hip for 6 years. Snow had grown. Snow was the size of a horse now, white and burning at the edges, and her eyes were not the eyes of a wolf. They were the eyes of a woman who had been waiting in a stone circle for 6 years for the one chance to be heard. The pups should have died with her. They didn't. You made sure they didn't. You sat up with them every night for 3 months. I let you have your 3 months. I let you have 6 years, Cad, because I loved you, because you were my brother. But the line is broken. The line is broken as long as your half-wolf Get is breathing. And tonight is the last night I am going to pretend it isn't. Put them down. Kaidman did not put them down. He shifted instead very slightly so that his body was between his children and his brother. Bran, against his chest, made a small sound. Era was very still and very awake, and her small hand had closed around the hilt of the knife at her father's belt, as though she had been thinking about that knife for some time. Arnie, look behind me. I am not going to fall for that, Cad. Look behind me. Arnie did not look. He stepped down off the last of the slope and into the ring of stones, and as his foot crossed the line of the outer stones, the humming in the bones of the stones changed pitch, and Snow stepped forward. Arnie saw her. Rose watched it happen. Arnie's easy face fell apart in pieces, like something held together by string, and the string had been cut all at once. He saw a white wolf the size of a horse standing between him and his brother and his nephew and his niece. And he saw, behind the wolf's face, something else. Something he had known for 6 years. And he made a noise that was not a word. No. No. You are dead. Snow did not speak. Snow had never spoken. Snow walked toward him, slow, and Arnie raised the sword, and Rose, who had not moved through any of this, took one step forward, and the stillness where her heartbeat had been opened up into something larger than her body. She did not feel power. The style profile of her own life would have told her, if she had been the kind of woman who read style profiles, that this was the moment for silver flame and golden light and the discovery of a hidden bloodline. There was no flame. There was no light. There was only the stillness, and snow inside the stillness. And Rose understood, as clearly as she had ever understood anything, that she was not the source. She was the door. Snow had been waiting 6 years for the door to open wide enough to walk through, and the door was opening now. And what walked through the door was not Rose's gift. It was Snow's grief, finally given a witness. Arnie swung the sword. He swung it at his brother, because his brother was the closest, because his brother was holding the children. The sword never landed. Snow met it in the air. She did not bite the blade. She walked into it, the way a person walks into a doorway, and the blade passed through her and came out the other side without slowing. And Arnie's face, as the blade passed through what should have been a body, went the color of old milk. He stumbled. He had thrown his weight into a swing that had met no resistance, and his foot came down on the flat stone Caedmon had lifted, and the stone, which had been balanced on the lip of the hollow, tilted under him. He fell. He fell into the hollow where the children had been hidden. He fell hard, on his side, and his sword fell with him, and the sword landed point up because that was the way it had been thrown, and Arnie landed on the sword. It was very fast. It was almost gentle. He looked up with the surprised face of a man who had not expected the world to be so literal, and he opened his mouth, and no sound came out, and his body went loose. The humming in the stones stopped. The wind, outside the ring, kept howling, but inside the ring, there was a long, perfect silence. And into that silence, Era said in a small, clear voice, "He was the man with the knife." Caedmon held both children for a long time. He did not check his brother. He did not need to. The other riders came down the slope in a clatter of hooves and shouting, and Selena was the first to reach them. And Selena took one look at the body in the hollow, and at the king on his knees, and at the maid standing in the ring of stones with a cat in her apron. And Selena did the thing that made her the chief huntsman of the Iron Hollow, which was to ask no questions and start giving orders. 2 riders down to bring the body up. 2 riders to scout the ridge for any of Arnie's men. 3 to make a sled for the children. Selena herself knelt beside Caedmon and unwrapped Bran's shoulder with hands that had bandaged the king's own wounds when he was a boy. And she made a low, approving sound at the cut, which had bled less than it might have because the cold had slowed it. And she pressed clean linen against it and wrapped it and lifted Bran into her own arms because Caedmon was not letting go of Era. Rose stood where she had been standing. She was not sure her legs would carry her. Snow was back to her ordinary size. Snow was sitting at Rose's feet, and her head was lower than it usually was, and her flanks were moving the way the flanks of a tired animal move. Suk climbed out of Rose's apron and went to Snow and pressed his small body against her shoulder, and Snow let him. And Rose sat down in the snow because her legs had decided for her. Caedmon came to her. He did not stand. He came on his knees, with Ada still tucked against him, and he stopped an arm's length from Rose, and he looked at her, and he said, "I do not know what to say to you. You do not have to say anything. I called you unfit. You did. In front of the whole intake line. 6 years ago. 6 years ago this past autumn. I do not remember why I said it. You said it because I came in without a wolf, and the kennel master had told you the new servant was scent broken. and you were 26 years old, and your father had been dead 2 months, and you were trying to look like a king. That is not a reason. No, it is not. He nodded, slowly, as though she had given him something he had needed. Era, against his chest, was watching Rose with the wide, unembarrassed eyes of a 6-year-old who had decided who Rose was already and was not going to be talked out of it. The White Lady. She is your wolf. Rose looked at Snow. Snow looked back at her. There was something in Snow's eyes that Rose had been seeing for 6 years and had never let herself name. And she let herself name it now, for the first time. And the naming was a kind of grief. She is not my wolf, Lamb. She has been keeping me company. But she was someone else first. Era's small face went very serious. Whose? Rose looked at Kaidman. Kaidman had gone still in the way he went still when something was about to cost him. He nodded once, the smallest movement, giving permission. Rose looked back at Era. Your mother's, Lamb. Era did not cry. She looked at Snow for a long moment, and then she reached out one hand, the same hand that had patted her father's beard, and she laid it on the air where Snow's muzzle was. And Snow lowered her head and let the small, invisible touch land. Bran, in Selena's arms, watched this with his usual silence and did not move. He had stopped bleeding. He was holding something in his good hand, and Rose saw, with a small, unexpected stab of tenderness, that it was a small bone, a knuckle bone of some forest animal, the kind of bone Bran was forever picking up and hoarding in the corners of his nursery. He had been holding it the whole time he was under the stone. Soot, who had left Snow's side, climbed into Bran's lap. Bran's silent face moved in the small, private way it moved when he was pleased. The riders came back with the sled. They lifted the children onto it. Kaidman stood, finally, and offered Rose his hand. And Rose took it, and her hand in his was the first time he had touched her in 6 years, and the first time he had touched her ever with care. He pulled her to her feet and did not let go at once. Rose Marrow, when we are home, when the children are warm, when the body of my brother is in the ground, I would like to speak with you. I do not know what about. I do not know what I have the right to say, but I would like to speak with you. Yes. He let go of her hand. They left the ring of stones. The storm had not stopped, but it had loosened, and they made the ride back in 3 hours instead of 4, and the sky began to gray toward dawn as they came in sight of the palace walls. Rose rode behind Kaidman again. Soot was inside her apron again. Snow did not run ahead this time. Snow walked at the horse's flank, and Rose, looking down at her, saw that Snow was fading. Not vanishing, not yet, fading the way a candle fades when the morning comes in through the window. Snow looked up at Rose once, and her eyes said the thing she had been waiting 6 years to say, and Rose understood it. And she put her hand against Cadman's back to steady herself, because the understanding hurt in a place she had not known could hurt. Snow had been waiting for the witness. The witness had been delivered. She did not have to stay anymore. The children were taken to the nursery. Selena stayed with them. The body of the king's brother was taken to the cold room beneath the chapel, where the priest who had served 3 Vale kings and would serve no 4th, received it without a word. The court was told nothing, yet beyond, the children are home, and the king's brother is dead, which was enough to keep them quiet through the rest of the morning. Rose was put in a small warm room near the nursery. Someone, she suspected Murdy, had built up the fire and laid out a clean shift and a bowl of broth, and Rose sat in front of the fire in the clean shift and ate the broth, and could not have said afterward what was in it. Soot lay in her lap. Snow lay at her feet. Snow was still fading. She was the size of a yearling again, and then the size of a hound, and the white of her was thinning the way thin cloth thins, and Rose put her hand down and rested it on Snow's back, and her hand passed through more than it landed on. Snow did not seem distressed. Snow seemed, for the first time in 6 years, at peace. Cadman came to the door near midday. He had not slept. He had washed the blood off his hands and changed his coat, and his beard had been combed. But his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept in 4 days now, and was going to keep not sleeping until something was settled. He stood in the doorway and did not come in. "May I?" "Yes." He came in. He sat in the chair across from her, not the one beside her, which was its own kind of carefulness. He looked at Snow. He looked at Snow for a long time. "She is leaving." "Yes." "How long?" "I do not think she will last the day." He nodded. He did not weep. He had wept already, Rose thought, somewhere between the war hall and the nursery, in a place no one had been allowed to see, and he had used up the weeping he was going to do in front of others. "I have been thinking, since we came back, about what I owe you." "You do not owe me." "I do." "I did not do it for you, my lord. I did it for the children. I would have done it for any children." "I know that. That is part of what I owe you." He folded his hands. They were big hands, and they were trembling slightly, and he did not try to hide it. "I have been thinking about the shape of it, the shape that the court will expect. There is a shape, you understand. The maid who saved the heirs, the king who was in her debt. There is an old word for it, a claiming, a public one. I could stand in the great hall this evening and put my hand on your shoulder and say a sentence, and your name would never be unfit again. Not in this house. Not in any house in the hollow." Rose felt her stillness change. Not the stillness where her heartbeat had been. A different one. A held breath. "I am not asking that of you. I want to be clear. I am laying the shape out for you because you have the right to look at it. You can have it if you want it. You can have a different shape. You can have a purse and a horse and a road out of here. If the road is what you want, I will give you any of them. I am not in a position to give you nothing." Rose looked down at Snow. Snow had gone very faint. Snow was almost the air itself now, and Rose could see the firelight through her, and Snow's eyes were closed. "May I think?" "As long as you want." He stood. He went to the door. At the door he stopped, and he said, without turning, "She loved you. I do not know how I know. I know." "She did not love me, my lord. She did not know me." "She knew you for 6 years." He left. Rose sat with Snow until Snow was a shape made mostly of memory, and then she lay down on the floor with her face against the place where Snow had been, and she let herself cry. Finally, for the first time since the laundry court, for a woman she had never met, and a wolf who had walked beside her for a third of her life, and a man who had knelt in his own war hall and asked her a question she did not yet know how to answer. Soot lay against her chest the whole time. Snow was gone before sunset. There was no sound. There was no farewell. There was only, at one moment, the faint white shape on the rug, and at the next moment, only the rug. Rose had thought she would not be able to bear it. She found, when it had happened, that she could. The stillness where her heartbeat had been was still there, but it was her own stillness now, not borrowed. And she lay on the rug and breathed into it, and understood, slowly, that this was what it was to be ordinary, and that ordinary was not the same as broken. She had been told for 6 years that she was broken because she had no wolf. She had had a wolf for 6 years. Now she had no wolf, and she was not broken. She had simply been carrying someone else's grief, and the grief had finished, and she was only herself, and herself was enough. She did not give Kaidman her answer that night. She did not give it to him the next morning either. He did not press her. He sent Murdy to her with another bowl of broth and a note in his own hand that said only, "Take the time you need." And Rose took the time. She slept eventually. She slept for almost a full day, and when she woke, the children were in her room, both of them, sitting cross-legged on the rug with soot between them and a small heap of forest bones laid out in some private order Bran had decided on. Era was telling Bran a long story about a goose. Bran was nodding occasionally. Neither of them looked surprised that Rose was awake. They had decided between them that she was theirs now. Rose did not have the energy to argue. She lay on her side and listened to Ada's story about the goose and watched Bran arrange and rearrange his bones. And after a while, Bran got up and brought her one of the bones and put it on her pillow and went back to his arranging. It was a gift. Rose knew enough about Bran already to know it was the largest gift he had to give. She held the bone in her hand and thought about Kaidman's offered shape, the public claiming in the Great Hall, the sentence that would unbreak her name. And she found that the thought no longer frightened her. But it did not fit her either. She did not want the Great Hall. She did not want a sentence. She had been a maid in this palace for 6 years, and she had been called unfit in front of 100 people. And the unmaking of that, if it was to happen, did not need to happen in front of 100 people. It needed to happen somewhere else, somewhere with broth and a fire and possibly a cat on her foot. She thought about this for some time. The children eventually went to find their dinner. Murdy came and went. The afternoon faded. Kaidman did not come. He had said he would not press, and he was not pressing, and Rose was grateful for it because the not pressing was its own kind of speech. He was telling her, by his absence, that the time was hers. She got up. She put on a clean dress, not the shift, an actual dress Murdy had left for her, plain gray wool, the kind of dress a senior servant wore. She walked down to the kitchens. The kitchens were the room in the palace she knew best, and the kitchen was where the children were, and the kitchen was where Kaidman, she had been told by Murdy with a small significant look, had taken to sitting in the evening since the children's return, because the children would not let him out of their sight for longer than an hour at a time. The kitchen smelled of bread and onions and the particular sweetness of the late winter apples that had been kept in the cold room since autumn. The undercook, a wide woman named Selena, not the huntsman, a different Selena, the kitchen one, who had taught Rose to debone a chicken when Rose was 19 and had trembled at every loud sound, saw Rose come in and went very still and then very busy, in the way kitchen people go busy when they want to give you privacy without leaving the room. Era and Bran were on the long bench by the fire. Era had a heel of bread. Bran had a cup of warm milk. Kaidman was beside them, not on the bench, but on the floor, with his back against the bench, his long legs stretched out, a tin cup of something hot in his hands. He looked up when Rose came in. He did not stand. He did not invite her over. He let her come. She came. She sat down on the floor beside him, because that was the seat that was open, and the undercook brought her a tin cup without being asked and went away again. Era leaned over the bench and looked down at them both with the expression of a small magistrate. "Are you going to live here?" "Era, are you?" Rose looked at the fire. The fire was small and good, and the apples in the corner gave off their old sweet smell. And Suk came in through the kitchen door he had taught himself to open and walked across the room and sat on Rose's foot. "I think so, lamb. I think I am going to stay." Caedmon did not look at her. He took a slow breath. In what shape? Not the Great Hall, not a sentence in front of the court. I do not need to be unbroken in public. I never was broken. I have only just understood that. All right. I would like to keep working, not in the laundry. I do not want to wash any more cloaks for a while. But the kennels, perhaps, or the kitchen children. I would like to be useful in the way I have always been useful, but with my own name said properly when it is said. All right? And I would like, sometimes, to sit on the floor of a kitchen with you and the children, if you will have me sit. He turned his head then. He looked at her, and his eyes were tired, and they were also something else, something Rose had not let herself look at directly until now. And she let herself look at it now, and it did not frighten her. "Rose Marrow, I will have you sit in any room I am in for the rest of my natural life, if you will let me." Era, above them, said, "Good," and bit into her bread. Bran said nothing, but he reached down with the hand that was not holding milk, and he laid it on top of Rose's head, the way one lays a hand on the head of a small thing one has decided to keep. And he left it there for a moment, and then he took it away and went back to his milk. Rose discovered she was laughing. It was a small sound, mostly breath. Caedmon was laughing too, the same small sound, and the undercook in the corner pretended not to hear. The fire moved. The apples kept their sweetness. Soot kicked his back leg in his sleep. There were things to settle. Rose was not foolish enough to think there were not. The body of the king's brother lay in the cold room, and would have to be accounted for to a court that did not yet know what he had done. And there would be counsels and accusations, and the slow, ugly unwinding of a 6-year secret. And Caedmon would have to do most of that unwinding in front of people who had loved Arnie and would not want to hear what he had been. There would be the matter of the wolfsbane, and the cordial, and the night the queen had died. There would be the matter of who else in the palace had known. Selena the huntsman thought there were 2, perhaps 3 others. Men and women who had ridden close to Arnie for years and might have heard things and chosen not to hear them. And those people would have to be questioned, and some of them would have to be exiled. And the questioning and the exiling would take weeks, and Caedmon would sleep badly through most of them. Rose understood this. She did not pretend it was not coming. But the days between the rescue and the first council were quiet days, by some unspoken agreement of the household, and Rose let herself have the quiet. She moved her things out of the laundry attic. There were not many things. A wooden comb, a second shift, a small carved bird her mother had given her when she was 8 and her mother was still living, before the village fever had taken everyone Rose had loved and sent her, an orphan of 14, on the road that had eventually delivered her to Iron Hollow at 19. The bird had a chip out of one wing. She had carried it in a pocket for 11 years. She put it on the mantel of the small, warm room near the nursery, which was now her room, and the bird looked, on the mantel, like it had been waiting for a mantle its whole life. Murdy came up the second morning to ask, with elaborate casualness, whether Rose would like a bigger room. Rose said no. The small, warm room was the right size. Murdy said, with even more casualness, that the king had been seen in the herb garden at dawn, alone, looking like a man working out how to ask a question. Rose said she imagined he was. Murdy said, with no casualness at all, that she had served 3 Vale kings and she had never seen one of them happier than the one who had sat on a kitchen floor last night with a tin cup, and then Murdy left before Rose could say anything to that, because Murdy was a woman who knew how to leave a sentence in the air. Rose worked, not the laundry. She had meant what she said about the laundry. She went, instead, down to the kennels, where the old kennel master Arnie, a different Arnie, an old man with a hair lip, named for the king's brother in a way that would have to be quietly reconsidered now, had always been kind to her in a wordless way. And she helped him with the morning feeding, and the dogs did the thing they had always done with Rose, which was to come to her with their heads low and their tails moving, as though she were one of their own. She had thought for a long time that the dogs did it because Snow was at her hip. She found, now that Snow was gone, that the dogs still did it. They had not been coming to Snow. They had been coming to her. She sat down in the straw and let 2 of the older bitches put their heads in her lap, and she scratched behind their ears, and she thought about the word Omega, which the palace had used to mark her broken for 6 years. And she thought about how nobody had asked the dogs what they thought, and the dogs had been the only ones in the palace who had had her measure from the start. The kitchen children came to her in the afternoons. They had always come to her. They came now with the boldness of children who had heard, through whatever underground river of gossip children share, that Rose was not in trouble anymore. There were 9 of them, ranging from Maddie, who was 4, to thin, tall, 15-year-old Tompkin, who was almost not a child. And they sat on the kitchen floor around Rose's bench and asked her questions about the storm, and the stones, and the white wolf. And Rose answered the ones she could, and dodged the ones she could not. And Ara and Bran sat among them as though they had always sat among them, which was not how the children of a king were usually allowed to sit, but was how Caedmon, it turned out, was raising them. Caedmon came through the kitchen sometimes when she was sitting with the children. He never stayed long. He would lean in the doorway and watch for a moment, and go on. The first time he did it, Rose had felt watched. The second time, she had felt accompanied. By the 4th time, she had stopped registering it as a separate event, and she understood that this was its own kind of courtship, the slow, unobtrusive kind that did not need a great hall, and she let herself be courted. He came to her room a week after the rescue. He came in the evening, after the children were in bed, and he knocked the way he always knocked. 3 soft knocks with the side of his fist, and Rose opened the door and let him in, and he stood in front of the fire for a long moment without speaking, the way he often did now, gathering himself. Soot was on the bed. Soot looked at the king with the impersonal assessment of a cat who has decided the king is acceptable and does not need further evaluation. I went to the stones. Today. Rose nodded. She had known he would, eventually. I took a stonemason. The hollow is going to be filled. The standing stones are going to be left. I have given orders that no one is to camp there or build there or quarry there. It is going to be a place that is left alone. Good. I told her. I sat in the ring for an hour and I told her. About the cordial, about Arnie, about the children, about you. Rose was quiet. She was not there. I did not expect her to be. I wanted her to know I knew she had not been there for a long time before this week. I wanted her to know I was sorry I had not seen her. Rose came and stood beside him at the fire. She did not touch him. She had not yet touched him, beyond the moment in the ring when he had pulled her to her feet.
He had not touched her either, and the not touching was a thing they were doing together carefully, neither of them rushing. Both of them aware that 6 years of cruel words and 3 days of a storm and 1 ring of stones were not enough foundation for the touching to be casual. The touching, when it came, was going to mean what it meant. They were both being careful with the meaning. Caedmon. He looked at her. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. He noticed. He did not say anything about it. I have been thinking about what I am. I do not have a wolf. I have never had a wolf. I had a queen's ghost walking beside me for 6 years, and I mistook her for a wolf because I did not have any other word for what she was. She is gone now. I do not have anything where she was. The court has a word for what I am. It is the same word they had for me when I came in the door at 19. Omega. Wolfless. Broken. You are not broken. I am not broken, but I am not a wolf. I am not going to become a wolf. The story would have me perhaps become a wolf. The story would have me discover that my mother was a hidden princess and my blood was full of silver fire and the wolflessness was a glamour. I have been turning that story over in my mind for a week, because I had a week of quiet to turn things in my mind. It is a pretty story. It is not my story. My mother was a weaver named Lynette, who died of fever when I was 14. There is no silver fire in me. There is no hidden bloodline. I am a maid named Rose who was kind to a ghost because nobody had taught me not to be. Caedmon was very still. I want you to know that. Before anything else happens between us, I want you to know that I am not going to become someone you can put a crown on without the court being upset about it. I am going to be a maid named Rose for the rest of my life. If you want a different woman, a noble woman, a woman the court can swallow without choking, I am not going to be angry. I would rather know now. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached over, slowly, and he took her hand. It was the first touch since the ring. His hand was warm and rough, and it closed around her fingers as though her fingers were something he had been told not to break. Rose, I have spent 6 years looking at noble women the court could swallow without choking. I have not wanted any of them. I want a maid named Rose. If the court chokes, the court chokes. If they cannot swallow you, they can spit you out, and I will go where you are spit. That is not how kingship works. It is how this kingship is going to work. She laughed. It was a wet laugh. He did not let go of her hand. He brought it up, slowly, watching her face the whole way, and he pressed the back of her hand against his mouth, and he held it there. And Rose felt the stillness where her heartbeat had been do a thing it had not done in 6 years. It moved. It was not Snow's stillness anymore. It was hers, and under it, very faint, very ordinary, was the thump of an actual pulse, the kind she had had as a girl before the ghost had come to live beside her, and she had not realized, until she felt it again, that the ghost had been quieting it the whole time. She was going to have her own heartbeat back. She was going to have to learn how to live with the loudness of it. He lowered her hand. He did not let go. May I? She nodded. He kissed her. It was not a king's kiss. It was a tired man's kiss in a small, warm room with a cat watching from the bed. It was careful and slow and brief.
and when it ended, he rested his forehead against hers and breathed for a moment. And she breathed with him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Soot, on the bed, made a soft chirp of approval and went back to sleep. Outside, in the corridor, somewhere far away, a child laughed in her sleep. The fire moved. The carved bird sat on the mantel with its chipped wing. The night went on. 3 weeks later, on a morning that was nearly spring, Rose was in the herb garden behind the kitchens. The garden was small and walled and had been let to go ragged, and she had asked Cadman 2 evenings earlier whether she might be permitted to put it back in order, and he had looked at her over his tin cup of broth and said, with great seriousness, "Rose Marrow, you may permit yourself anything in this house, including the garden." And Era had said, "Good, because I want sage." And Bran had said nothing and held up 4 fingers, which Rose had eventually understood to mean 4 kinds of mint. She was on her knees in the cold dirt with her sleeves pushed up. The first green points of the chives were coming up. The thyme had survived the winter, mostly, though one corner of it was dead and would have to be replaced. Soot was lying in the patch of morning sun by the wall, with one paw over his eyes because the sun was too direct, and he was asleep in the way he was always asleep when she was working, attentive even in sleep, an ear flicking every time she shifted. The garden gate creaked. She did not look up. She knew the sound of his step by now. He came in and stood at the edge of the bed and watched her for a moment, the way he liked to watch her. And then he sat down on the low wall and stretched his legs out in front of him and waited. She finished the row she was working on. She sat back on her heels. He had a small package in his lap. She had not noticed it from her angle on the ground. He held it out without making a ceremony of it. "What is this?" "Open it." It was wrapped in a piece of plain linen, tied with twine. She wiped her hands on her apron and untied the twine, and the linen fell open, and inside was a small carved wooden bird. It was not exactly like the one on her mantel. It was a different bird. A wren, perhaps, where the other was a sparrow. It had been carved recently. The wood was still pale. It had been carved by someone who was not, technically, a very good carver, and the wing on one side was a little thicker than the wing on the other. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at him. "You made this." "I did." "When?" "Evenings, after the children are down. I have not been sleeping much. I needed something to do with my hands." "It is not a very good bird." "It is not." "I love it." He smiled. It was a small private smile, the kind that lived in his mouth and did not have to travel to his eyes to be a smile. He did not look away from her. "There is no occasion. I want to be clear. This is not a bond gift. This is not an offering. The court is going to want me, in the spring, to make a thing of us. They are going to want a ceremony. We will see. I am not asking you about that today. Today I am giving you a wooden bird because I am the kind of man who carves wooden birds now, apparently, and I would not have known that about myself if you had not sat down on the kitchen floor beside me." She set the bird very carefully on the wall beside him. She got up off her knees. Her knees protested. She brushed the dirt off her apron, and she came and sat down on the wall beside him and the bird, and she put her head on his shoulder, because she had earned the right to put her head on his shoulder by now, and she was going to use the right while she had it. He went still. He always went still when she touched him, the way a man holding a small wild thing goes still. He laid his cheek on the top of her head. The garden was quiet around them. From the kitchen came the sound of the undercook arguing affectionately with the bread boy. From further off came Era's voice, pitched to Carrie, telling Bran something about a horse. The horns, far up on the watchtower, were silent. They had been silent for 3 weeks. Rose listened to her own heartbeat. It was loud in her own ears, the way it had been loud when she was a girl. She had thought she would never get used to it. She was getting used to it. She closed her eyes. She thought for a moment of Snow. Snow had lain down at her feet 1,000 evenings in the laundry attic, and Rose had not understood then what kind of present she was being given. She understood it now, mostly. There were parts of it she would never understand. There was a queen who had loved her children enough to refuse the door for 6 years, and there had been a maid gentle enough to be the place the queen waited. And the maid and the queen had not chosen one another in any way either of them would have known to call choosing, and the not choosing had been its own kind of love. Rose had been afraid, at first, that the love had been entirely Snow's, and that she, Rose, had only been a vessel, and that the vessel did not get to keep anything. She had been wrong about that. Snow had left her something. Not a power, not a flame, something smaller and harder to name. The knowledge that she had been chosen, once, by someone who had not had to choose her. The knowledge that she was the kind of person who could be chosen in that way. The knowledge, finally, that she had been worth walking beside. She lifted her head. He let her lift it. She picked up the wooden bird from the wall. She turned it over in her hands. The wing that was too thick was warm where his thumb had rested while he carved. I am going to put this on the mantel, beside the other one. All right. They are going to live there together. All right. She looked at him. He looked back. There was no hum. There was no thread. There was no pull. There had never been one, in her, and there was not going to be one now, and she had stopped expecting one. There was only the small, ordinary morning, and the bird in her hand, and the man beside her, and the cat in the sun, and somewhere inside the kitchen wall a child laughing, and the stillness that had once been Snow's was her own again, and her heart, inside the stillness, was beating the way it had always meant to beat. She put the bird in her apron pocket. She took his hand. They sat on the wall a while longer. There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me. The cloak still warm at the bottom of the hamper, Bran's silent hand laying itself on Rose's head in the kitchen, Snow letting Ada's small, invisible touch land at the rim of the stones. I would love to know which one landed for you. See you in the next story.